And we are recording.
Okay, good. Typically, I don't really think about this overly much, but do we, what kind of record do we keep of the workshop? And we don't have a clerk? Is there something that we should be mindful of recording?
Generally there it's the same as it would be a discussion, like an item we discussed at a regular meeting. There, so just the basics so people understand what the conversation was about.
Okay. All right, so actually it's not a meeting, so just open the workshop on the school budget. So we have several things to go over. One of the things I wanted to do before we started talking about this, working on next year's budget, is one of the things we did at the beginning of the year is that we did not act on terms and conditions, individuals here in school for any kind of raise. They were frozen. And that is something that I think, since our money was not frozen and they worked the entire year, I was wondering, I just wanted to feel people out as to whether you thought that that was something we should use. We could do, we could take action to give them a lump sum payment that would represent the raise that they would have gotten over the year, and then use that number as their salary entering the next year's budget. What are people's thoughts about that?
As far as financials go, I think, you know, I don't believe there was no budgeted raises for those individuals, but there are budget dollars in different salary lines that have not been expended and I don't believe are going to be expended. So in terms of, you know, money in the budget, it's there should you decide that you want to go forward with it. And, you know, depending on what you want to do, I worked on some spreadsheets, so that will be a pretty, you know, in terms of updating any changes that you want to make, I can turn that around in about an hour and show those, not only, you know, updated for this year's budget, but pretty easily readjust their starting salaries for next year's forecast.
People in agreement with moving forward with that? I mean, we're not taking action tonight, but just making the plan in order to make sure that we hold the money from this budget and then working from those numbers for next year.
Now, so we have to, you know, probably have this buttoned up by Thursday, so if that's something you want to do, and to have it ready for next year's budget, I mean, we guess we could, because we have to approve the property tax report card every Thursday night too, and that is based on the budget, so if that's something you want to do, it's probably.
Well, even if we just put those numbers there, whether we acted or not.
Perfect.
It's not going to be an issue
Okay.
as far as the total budget.
Okay. I can do that. I'll make some assumptions, put them in the budget. If we act on them, fantastic, we have the money there. If not, we don't spend it.
And one of the things, I've been doing a lot of looking at the debt service information. Lynn Derwave shared with me 2 payment options,
Okay.
but we only saw 1. Can you explain?
2 payment options we need.
Yeah. There was actually a preferred one, or assumed one, where we sell the bonds in July and the bonds are due in July, and it has a different estimated bond and debt service.
So that's when we talked about this in the beginning. We had 2 options. We could start the bond payments in the next fiscal year and then get credit for those payments through state aid. If we push those payments off, then we've still got to refinance, you know, we're going to still have the bond issue. We had the opportunity to push that bond payment off until the year after next, the previous fiscal year, but we didn't do that because that gave us a negative tax cap of about 5%. We would have had to return tax dollars to taxpayers, so.
Okay, so that has to do with the tax.
Yes, and we discussed that, I think it was my very first meeting, we presented the options, and we decided that we were gonna go with the
Well,
one
we
that.
didn't see this. All we saw was the formula for the tax cap.
Okay, yep,
We didn't see this part.
okay.
So it's related to the tax.
Yeah, so basically, if we went with that first option, it created about a negative 5% tax cap, negative 5% tax cap, which we decided we did not want to go with, so we decided, because we're gonna have to pay it one way or the other. And we figured we might as well start it, get the credit in the next fiscal year from state aid, and go out at 0, so.
Well, it's just that it assumed the borrowing schedule, which shows that first one, where we don't pay the principal in the first year. So, why would they have assumed that that would have been the more likely one for us to go with?
Because the first one put us, I mean, again, this is, all that information on the tax cap came from that sheet, but the decision was made during our first meeting, and I presented, that, those numbers were used to put together the property tax cap. And the discussion we had was, in that first scenario, we ended up at like minus 4.58%, which would have put us at a negative tax cap, or the second option would have put us, you know, where we were currently at the tax cap, at 0.7. And that was the discussion we had. These are the two options, and,
And that may be the only decision there is to make is based on that tax cap piece. I mean,
that's our discussion we had. There really wasn't much other decision to make. And that's how we presented it, and that's the feedback I got from everyone, so.
The point I'm trying to make is we did not see the supporting documentation
Okay.
for that decision. So that's why I'm questioning why we're seeing it after the fact. It would have made, we were confused as to why we were being asked to make that decision based on the one sheet that we had. And, you know, this does show it. It doesn't, the only thing that actually showed that, this actually shows a preferential payment schedule, but balancing it with the 5% minus makes a difference. But I'm just making the point, I know we had the discussion, it's just we did not have all of the information.
I guess I just went through the assumptions about how we were going to think and decide, because it seems to me, and I haven't given this a great deal of thought because I haven't known about this for a long time, but if we were to go with the first option, which was the sell the bonds in July, and then the bonds are due in July following year,
Yep.
that we could actually, so tax cap would be a negative 5%, but we could ask the voters and say, hey, this is a better deal, because our local effort's less, we end up paying less total. So let us go over the tax cap back to a less than 2%. And so that or go to a 0%. I mean, I don't know exactly, I'd have to do a partial budget on to see where that fell out, but we would need to get a supermajority to do that. But if there's a strong economic argument to do it, and we're saying, listen, we're not going above 2%, right? We're not, you know, because it's one thing to ask people, you know, say, okay, we're going to go from, we want to go over that 2% or over 3% or whatever, right? I mean, I think that's a much tougher argument to say, we want to come back to where we would have been anyway, and this allows us to take advantage of this opportunity. Now, I don't know exactly how it all pencils out, but I guess those are the type of decisions that I feel like it makes sense for the board to be presented with and be able to think through and not just assume, because I think that we don't necessarily have to go with that, that negative tax cap. We could actually ask the voters if we could go over that negative.
If you go over the negative tax cap, that is essentially, that requires the 60% majority vote, and that's fine.
Right, and we typically, I mean,
Sure.
you know, I think if we can make a strong informed argument, right, so supermajority, but those are typically margins that we have our budget's strongly supported, and I think if I'm not saying that's what we want to do, but I just think those are the type of discussions that I think the board should be allowed to.
Because, and if we had done that, if we had looked at it and said, if we got the minus, the tax cap at
Negative,
negative five, but we are already we put $450,000 to reduce the tax levy. So would that, I mean, would that have played, we should have done that? We're already covering part of it based on the tax levy that we had on the tax cap last year. I guess I'm not saying it too clearly because I'm not
No,
really,
I'm
not
like,
fresh thinking.
my brain is like just almost grasping
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, I understand what you're asking, and I don't know the answer to that.
Because we had a levy, which we dropped because we appropriated fund balance for it. So
Right, the
would
400.
Would that actually change the levy? Or did we set the levy and then reduce it?
I think we set the levy and then reduced it.
think that's what.
Right, I mean, it was in August, I guess I'd have to.
Which means we artificially lowered
Right.
I don't know whether it was 5%
No, I don't, right.
or what that difference would have made, but.
Well, it was, yeah, $500,000 on $5 million. Right, I mean, local burden's 5 million-ish, and that was half of it. So it seems like it'd be more than,
I don't know how it works,
I don't know exactly, with that calculation piece, I don't know. But
because there is a difference in the numbers here.
But no, I mean, at the very least, I think that's worth knowing this, right? Just in order to then have that conversation.
So, are you following our conversation?
I am following the conversation, yes.
So, I mean, we just, since we did not have all of the information and didn't realize what the impact was, you know, the numbers are different as far as our local share and what we will
Right,
actually
it's
pay.
$130,000, right?
Yeah.
So over those 15 years, it's $130,000, so it's not a load of money every year, but it's directionally appropriate, it's $130,000.
And if we were to take the additional state aid and put that into debt reserve, we could
We
apportion it
would
out.
not get the state aid because it wasn't paid.
So we wouldn't,
We would get the state aid the following fiscal year. So if we paid, the one scenario is paying it next fiscal year, the second scenario is paying it in 22, 23. So since we didn't pay the bond next fiscal year, we would not be eligible for state aid the next fiscal year.
but you're showing aid in this estimated building aid, it's showing aid,
For 21 or 22?
22. It's showing $1,045,000 in state aid in the top line. Which is exactly what it shows here. It doesn't show it offset.
And that's when the negative estimated local share, right, that 708,000, which would then be money that we could put into a reserve, I think.
Selling bonds in July, bonds due in July.
The numbers here are advantageous over the numbers here.
Yeah.
But then it fills up that line, so it shows us that we're
Yep.
getting this. And then if we got this as a balance, it
Yep.
could go into reserves or, you know, into that debt line. And if we apportion it, it's 51.
I was told that, again, the way it was explained to me, if we didn't pay the bill in that building year, then we couldn't get the aid for it. That's how it was explained to me from fiscal advisors. And I don't know if
But this is from them, this is what they generated.
I don't know when it was, because the one I looked at had the first bond payment being made in 2023, not 22.
Well, then can we have an updated copy?
I'll try to get you up to the copy, yes.
Because on the back, it doesn't have. And both of the ones on the back show starting at 22, year 22.
Yeah, and that's why I'm wondering that, because if you pay the bonds, the two scenarios I was given was one next fiscal year, one the fiscal year after, so I don't know. I don't.
So that would be something that we would need some clarification on. not sure what, does he opt to do that, or?
Not sure.
All right, well then we. Oh. Okay. Wait for him, or? All right. Dr. Glover, maybe perhaps you can answer this one. I know that in the state budgets, they did have universal pre-K programs. I know they
Yeah.
opened up that funding again.
Yep.
But it has to be compliant with the requirements for universal pre-K. Are
Yes.
you familiar with what might need to come in line for us?
I think there's a couple things. The grant money is supplement, not supplant. And my understanding is that the grant money is also for a full-day program, not a partial-day program. Which was something we looked at last year and before, and then we had some community concern about that being too big of a program. We generally follow UPDK guidelines already. So anything that we would need to do would be small and tweak-wise, and we maintain the ratios, for the number of kids in a classroom, we maintain the adult ratios in separate classrooms for the smaller sizes. So some of that we do already. There's access to meal programs, for breakfast and lunch, and we have started that up because not only is it a requirement for the universal pre-K program, it's also a requirement for the federal feeding program, that if you have a school program in place while a lunch period or a breakfast period is going on, everyone has to have access to that. So we're following that, though, through the federal guidelines on the lunch program, not necessarily on the UPK. So a couple tweaks. We would have to be comfortable with going with a full program. We would be able to maintain 2 sections still, because we already have the teacher and the aide in for 1, and the grant would cover, the next classroom and the next aide, if you will, for that classroom space, but it has to be additional. And since we're part-time right now, going to the full-time would be an additional service, it wouldn't be a supplanting.
So is the $177,000 in the state aid line that we got?
It's listed for us, but my understanding is it is not included in the state aid line. It's a set aside.
Right, but I mean, in our numbers here, the ones that we were presented for our budget summary, where we're talking about the state aid, does that include the money that would have been earmarked for universal pre-K?
No, those funds were not marked into the budget for the universal pre-K.
There is I don't think maybe this is outdated, but there is a NICEAD document here that says UPK programs may either be half day or full day. They have to operate 5 days per week, a minimum of 180 days per year. I can send that URL. I don't know whether but that's on the NICEAD.gov website.
Right.
I don't know whether that changes the thought process or not.
So would it be actual cost? It would be a grant for which we would have to identify the cost of the
Yes.
program?
Yes.
So we could put some transportation in there, the aid, no other additional support services, correct? Or actually nurse? I mean, there's ways to.
Yep. We would need to, I would need to look into some of those details. I know Rich has gone and, Rich has just done a training on it, so he's got some more of the details. But I would think that anything that's supportive of that program would be able to be included in there. They generally are.
So is that a decision we have to make, whether if we need to know whether it is a full day or?
If we're going to pursue those funds,
Yeah.
then it's going to need to be a full day. If not, then I'm not sure we're gonna have access to those funds. There, I think
Why does
there's,
it have to be full day?
if we're going to pursue those funds, it's gonna have to be a full day program.
Because we need the extra expense?
No, because you have, I think in the grant, it makes it a requirement of it being a full day program. The exception to that being the possibility of a third grade, a 3-year-old program, which we've shied away from in the past. But that's detail I would have to reread and look at, or wait for Rich to come back in.
Jackie,
No, I was just a little confused, so we would have, because we would have to go to the full day, we would have 2 sections. Is that what you were saying?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm just making sure I understand.
Yeah. So we, one of the reasons we went to the part-time was to make sure we could service all of our kids, right? Because we knew we generally get about 10 kids less in pre-K than we're gonna get in kindergarten. And that's kind of been the trend over the past few years. So in order, before, knowing that we get around 40-ish kids, that means, we can't have any more than 18 or 36 between 2 programs. That would ensure that we would get everybody. And I think back in December or January, you have.
You go over 18 if you have a second paraprofessional in there, I think, right?
You can, if you end up going over, you can bring another paraprofessional in. We've avoided that. And mainly because of class sizes and, not wanting to make those class sizes too big.
But their full day is really not on the same schedule as ours, right? I mean, most of the programs either start a little later than a normal school and leave a little earlier. At least the ones around in our
Yeah.
county.
For these guys, the first group starts in the morning day part, so it's generally like 8 to 10:30, and then.
No, I know how it works
Okay.
now, but if we transition,
Oh,
that's something
to a
we're gonna,
full day?
right, have to, because I mean, they're not provided specials, so with our teacher, do you know what I mean? So
Yeah.
their day is gonna be not as long as a kindergarten.
Yeah, and I think we would have to talk that out
Yeah.
about what would it look like.
Right.
Yeah, because the structure of the full day is different
Is a
than the
little
structure of
different
the
than
half day.
Yeah.
Bob, you're finding, is it usually they're dated? If they're on the website, they have it, let them.
They just email me, but I don't see it. Oh, that's been a little while. It's back in 5 years ago, 6 years ago, so it may not be accurate anymore.
So,
It's, I would love to see us go to a full day for a program. I mean, the curriculum is set up for it to be a full day program. Especially if, we can get the state to take over the revenue to pay for that program, because that comes right out of our general budget. I am all for that, but I also know that the main piece last time was parents were concerned about the length of day for a 4-year-old. But I think a lot of that would come down to how do we structure our day, because it's not kindergarten, right? I mean, it's not sit down and you have an hour ELA and then an hour of math, and then, it's not that type of a run when you're doing the younger kids.
is Cambridge program a
It's
universal?
a long time for any age.
That's what I was trying to think. I'm not 100% sure. I feel like it is.
Okay,
They're like a 9 to 1.
9 to 1.
Yeah.
Because that allows them that food service time. too.
Yeah. Yep.
So, actually, I do think it's a good idea to align ourselves with universal pre-K. And even if it means going to, the 2 classrooms, if it's 9 to 1, then there are transportation costs as well, because there would be additional runs for that. But I do think that between what we're expending now and the $177,000 that has been earmarked for us, that we can comfortably provide those options. So is this something that we should be adding into the budget and looking at moving forward to align ourselves with universal pre-K requirements?
I have no opposition to it at all. I don't know how Karen feels. Or thoughts. I know Karen and I haven't chatted about it yet. Karen, any thoughts on full day UPK?
Well, you and I talked about it last year, way before COVID ever hit. I can remember having that conversation. You know, I like the idea, but it's definitely something that we need to sit down and talk and plan and figure out the reception for that, because I don't know how parents feel about sending their kids all day. That's a whole other question. At such a young age, a lot of people, I think the expectation is it will be a shorter day. So, I don't know. I
I'm
think it's
not-
worth that. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I'm not saying that we're committing to it. It's just
Oh,
that
no.
if we put those funds in there, I mean, if we don't put them in there, there's no way we can incorporate it. But if we put them in, we can start the exploration for whether it's something that we want to come into line with and to get those funds.
For the universal pre-K?
Yeah.
Those funds are part of the state aid package,
Mhm.
and they were broken out, but they were already included in the state aid revenue numbers, so they're
They're already in there.
built into that state aid number, yes.
So they are.
They're there and available, but it's an allocation, and we don't get it. And I talked to Jason Breslin, who is the executive director for early childhood at the state, and he's having a webinar on the 28th. He still doesn't have all the answers, but he's 99% certain it's going to be for full-time programs. 2 half-days will not qualify for full-time, and that's the direction I've gotten on that.
Okay. So, but full-time is not a regular school day. So,
I'm sure they'll have guidelines, and what's going to happen is sometime in May there'll be a almost like a grant process where you're going to have to go in, present your pre-K plan, the hours, and I'm sure they're going to have very specific guidelines and requirements for universal pre-K. They're not out yet, but my guess is they're coming sometime in May. And we're going there again, April 28th. Jason's having a webinar to answer some of those questions. I talked to him last week, and he still wasn't sure of all the specifics.
all right, so, but currently in that, right now, the way you identify our state aid, it does include those funds.
Yeah, we have, those funds are available.
So when you say those funds are
Oh, wait.
available, are they already applied to our revenue stream for the budget, or?
Oh, no, they're not part of our revenue stream, but I think they are, even though they're being provided by the state, they're gonna be in the F budget, because that money came from federal funds that the state recouped.
Okay.
So they're not gonna be part of the general revenue budget anyway.
So what that does is that puts those revenues into an account outside of the general budget.
So they'll come in like the CARES grant or any of those other grants, once we apply, those monies will come into the
Okay.
other side of the budget.
So it's not anything that we would add into the general fund budget
Right.
account
Because
as,
it's not, yeah.
it's because it's gonna come out of the aid budget, does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's gonna come out of the aid budget rather than the general budget.
Okay,
Just like all the other federal funds we've been allocated. I think on the state website shows about $2.4 million, but there's a lot of hoops to jump through with those, and when those come in, they'll be on the F side as well.
And I think this is new this year because of COVID, is that there's a lot more in the revenue stream coming into that F budget than we've really seen in the past. Generally, like title funds, right? They're federal funds, but they flow into, they flow in and we pull out from there, and some of the other revenue streams come right into our general budget. Whereas a large chunk of this federal money is coming into that special budget there, so we're gonna be able to do things that we'll be able to include, but outside of,
so we don't need to allocate them in
No.
this budget?
exactly.
No,
So,
and the other reason that they're putting them in the F budget is because they did not increase the 4%. There was no increase in the 4% that we could hold, so they didn't want us to get these funds, not be able to use them this fiscal year, and then have to, allocate them somewhere, because they were planning on raising that limit up to about 6 or 8%, they didn't. So now they're just having everything go into the F fund, so it doesn't affect those revenues.
And it buys us some time.
No, I just wanted to make sure that if we were going to access those funds, that if we needed to appropriate them in the lines.
We are allocated those funds, and when we apply for them, what we get will come in at that point. That's why they're not included, because unlike foundation aid and a lot of the other aids, it's not a guarantee that we're gonna get it until we apply.
Okay. So if we were to use those rescue plan money for staffing, we don't have to build that staffing into the regular budget?
No. For universal pre-K, no.
And then if we get to a spot where those funds go away, say this lasts for 3 years, because a lot of these
That's
monies
fair.
are gonna be 3 years,
Yeah.
the board will need to make a decision down the road, how does it want to handle the expenditures attached to those revenues? It can either absorb those costs and put it into the general budget and maintain them, or, those services or those people or those expenses can go away with the grant as the grant goes away.
We spoke at a meeting on Friday, and they talked about when the state first rolled out the universal pre-K, and they made it available. I think it was only a short-term thing, and then after 3 years, they capped it, so if you were in, they continued to fund it for you, and if you weren't, you didn't get the funding. And the consensus and the feeling was that's, probably what they're looking at, because, this isn't something to, universal pre-K is a big thing on a federal and state level, so I think they're looking to make this sustainable. Doesn't mean they're going to, but I think they got it in there for 3 years, and the consensus among all the other business officials is that, you could see something like that happen again, so.
So, but that is something that I think we should look at
Yeah.
carefully to see if that would be something that we can access those funds for.
Just wanted the board to know that it's not something you have to vote on for to bring to voters.
Okay. Also, the coronavirus stimulus, is that coming through that federal money?
That's
too?
coming through the federal money, and that was what my meeting was on. We talked about it for 2 hours. We have an allocation of about $2.4 million. That isn't guaranteed money for us. Those funds, and again, there's been no specific direction. We expect the application process to open up sometime mid-May. But State Ed spoke for about an hour on Friday, and what they said, what the guidelines they had so far were 15% of the monies had to be targeted towards summer enrichment and after-school programs, and basically the rest is going to follow the SMART guidelines. And what they don't want it to do is to replace local funds with federal funds. So generally, the idea with those federal funds is to help students get back on their feet when they come back to school. So, in summer enrichment programs, after school programs, tutoring programs, even psychologists and therapists and stuff. And the idea is that they're going to fund these for 3 years because they figure it may take 3 years to get some of these students back on track. So they're going to allow us to spread those funds out over 3 years. But while it's allocated, we're only going to have access to the programs that we can provide that are eligible. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So those monies are allocated, and we'll fill out a grant process. They'll have some requirements for us to fill out some information, and once we fill it out and we show them what we want to use it for and it's approved, then they'll send the funds to us to pay for the programs.
And in handling those, like our summer school program, for example, that's something we're gonna wanna do whether these funds come together or not. I think we kind of agreed to that in a previous meeting. So those funds, we wanna keep those in the general budget. They are there now. And then if the grant funds can handle those, because we haven't had this type of piece, we can move that into that special fund because it's an enhancement or an enrichment.
We took the summer school funds out.
Have you done that already?
We took the summer school funds out because all that billing is going to go through the federal funds. When I looked at, the requirements, there are some funds that you can only have access to for summer school and stuff like that. So it didn't make sense to take them out of the general budget because we're going to be pulling them out of those funds. And the allocation is there. We know the money we're going to get. We just don't know the specifics yet. So again, I'm very comfortable that there'll be funding for that because that's specifically what it's targeted for.
So if we were to have left it in the general fund, then it would have been a program, and if we would have supplanted rather than supplemented.
Right, yeah, we
We'd have to
wouldn't
build
have spent the money in the general fund, it would have been there, and we would have still pay for it out of the federal funds.
So in this budget that we are crafting for adoption,
Yes.
we do not have to allocate lines
No.
for
Summer school.
additional staff, summer school.
Not for anything for summer school. There was about a $60,000 spend, and in talking to state ed, and talking to the other business managers, that's especially with state ed, their recommendation was to not fund them through the general fund, but to fund them through the federal funds.
So 20% of 1/3 of that amount has to be spent on summer?
So, when
That'd be
I,
more than $60,000, isn't
yeah, so 15% of the total 4.5 million, so I had some specifics here, it's not, it's like one page, but it's about 15% of that money is specifically allocated for summer enrichment programs and after-school programs, to give students extra time trying to catch up, and it has to be used for just that. Not only 90% of the total funds were allocated to the schools, the state kept 10% back for some other purposes, but yeah, 15% is specifically dedicated to summer enrichment after-school programs.
it? So those are conversations to come. Right.
Once we get more specifics, and we should have more specifics, sometimes in the middle of May, state ed still hasn't put out any terms and conditions yet. Once they come in, we'll know better the process when we get that started.
Rich, would you say that was a part two, when we started talking here about, the principal's requests for some of those additional supports in AIS, that be places where we put those people?
Yes, that would definitely, so in talking to state ed, they talked about, the language is very clear, not only to help support them in an educational sense, but, emotional support, homeless support, all those type of things that we may be seeing because of COVID would be eligible for those funds. The only caveat is, those funds are only gonna be available for 3 years. So if we hire a therapist, or we hire, a particular full-time person, after those funds run out, we're gonna either have to make a decision, the idea behind these funds is to help bridge the gap over the next 3 years for our students. And if if at the end of 3 years, we decide the bridge has been gapped, and, or the gap's been bridged, and the students don't need the extra support, that's a decision we make. If we still wanna keep it, will have to be funded locally. And maybe in 3 years, they may continue to extend it. It's hard to predict the future, but right now it's set up for about 3 years. And then, either the program ends or it's funded locally.
All right, so that saves some of the stressor on.
Yeah, that allows us to make that decision, not tonight, sometime in the future. And, if we want to try to maximize the utilization of those federal funds. So to me, it makes sense, if we're going to go down that road, to fund it through the federal funds, take advantage of every one of those dollars we can possibly get, and then when they're not near it anymore, then we can make a decision going forward.
Now, you left for a minute, didn't you? Came
Yes.
back with a.
Yeah, I have the same information you have. I'll contact fiscal advisors in the morning and get clarification. But the way it was described to me when I first started, this was right a couple months ago when I first started, that if we didn't make the bond payment in the next fiscal year, we didn't get the aid. And then that combined with the negative tax cap was why this was the only option. But I will get a clarification on that tomorrow morning and get that information out to everyone.
But, okay. Because what it shows is us making a payment in July,
Yeah,
which
but
would be in 2022, so, but it's much
if
smaller.
we make the payment, if we make the first bond, the first bond payment is gonna be made in 2022, but not until July, not until the 22-23 fiscal year. We're looking at the 21-22. So that's how it was explained to me. Because if we make it in July, that's actually not the next fiscal year, it's the fiscal year after that. And the idea was, we're gonna make the bond, the one payment, July.
It's a day later.
Yeah,
Next
July 30th, but it keeps it in the next fiscal year, or June 30th, or July 1st puts it in the next fiscal calendar.
But we're doing 21-22, right?
Yes.
And it says in the year fiscal year ending June 30th. Right, but 2022, so does that mean?
July of 22, which is the fiscal year 22-23.
Same calendar year.
Same calendar year,
same
just
week.
different fiscal
Same
year.
calendar year, same state.
Right, so what this means is when
It's
you're,
still a different.
thank you, now I remember, so it's the year, that's the year we're gonna make the payment, but all of those aids are gonna happen in the fiscal year 22-23, not 21-22.
But it's showing in the year ending in fiscal year 2022. It's showing that in this column.
That, the way I was explained, and again,
I'm just saying that that's what the chart shows.
yes, I agree,
So
Yep.
if I can clarify.
I will definitely get that clarified.
Does anybody else have any questions about revenue or how we?
Well, I guess actually, just before we jump, I mean, if we're talking about fiscal year 21-22, and so if it says fiscal year ending June 30th of 22, I guess that's 21-22, right?
Yep.
So. Oh, that's clear.
But either way, that it still shows the same line for 22 in both June or July.
Oh, you're right, yeah.
So whether, I'm surprised that, but it reads the same way for both scenarios.
Yep, I agree.
All right, so I think for me anyhow, the best thing to do is take each chunk of the budget, take a look at it. If there's any questions or concerns, this would be the time to talk about it. So, Board of Education, I do see that the district clerk salary has been brought back up to 4,000. Anybody have any questions or concern on the Board of Education grouping? Heidi, Dan, chime in if you have anything. One of the things I have, and as we move through, this is going to be recurring themes, I'm going to ask it straight up. And looking at the budget, the change, especially in salaries, is there's no consistency anywhere. So at different points, there's 4, there's 2.5, there's 1.5,
So,
they're all over.
when I put the numbers in the budget for 21-22, the 4% increase was put on their current salaries. If you're looking at a 4% change from the budget from 2021 to the budget 22, it's not gonna work out that way because what was budgeted isn't the exact salaries that were paid out this year.
But see, that's where we want to make sure that we have those numbers in there, because we're going to pay them.
I can't go back, so last year's budget numbers are what's the challenge. This year's budget numbers, I budgeted exactly at 4%. So I went through, the first time we ran it, the numbers were calculated through WinCap. And, some questions were asked. So what I did is I calculated the numbers outside of WinCap and then had Tina do the same thing. We verified those numbers. We took everybody's salary contracts. If you look at the salaries for the principals, what's in the budget last year doesn't match their salary, or what's in the budget for this current fiscal year doesn't match what their salaries add up to. So whatever was budgeted last year, they were either budgeted, there was probably an over budget, and that could happen. Like this year, we did the assumption 3.5% for the WASIA folks. If they come in through negotiation and it's lower, the budget's actually gonna be higher than the actual payment. So I don't know why those budget numbers were put in there last year. It's not something I did, but the 21-22 numbers are based on 4% of their actual salaries, not off the budget from last year. Because that's what their actual salary is gonna be.
Okay, so I'm gonna plead ignorance on this one, because I'm not understanding. What I had said to you
Yep.
is that what we want to do is take action to make adjustments in the salary that they are receiving in this actual year.
Right.
So that would change their numbers.
Right. And we can do that, but that's not, when you look at 2021,
But we want the salary trajectory to stay,
correct. So when I budget for next year's budget, I will take whatever new salary they get and add 4% to that, and that's what will be placed in the budget for next year. I can't go back and change what was already originally budgeted. So when we're comparing budget over budget, we have to look at what was originally budgeted last year for 2021 and compare it to what was budgeted for 21-22.
Okay,
So what was budgeted for 2021 was not the total of their salaries. So if I was to take 4% off of the budgeted number, it would be way more than a 4% increase for all the employees. The actual numbers that you're looking at for 2021 are at a 4% increase for the non-union folks, 3.5% for the Wasia folks, and the teachers were all placed on step. So I went through their current step. I looked at their next step, put the salaries in, including any additional monies for what they have for graduate credits, and that's what I based their next year's salary off of.
so would you repeat that again? 4%?
4% for,
Terms and conditions?
for administrative folks,
Oh,
assumptions.
terms and conditions,
Yes.
there's more than just the administrative.
Yes, yep. 3% for, I know we're having a union contract negotiation, so anybody that falls under that contract was budgeted at 3%, 3.5%. And then the teachers were budgeted according to their current contract. I went through everybody's salary contract individually. I put together a spreadsheet with every employee in the building, looking at their current salary, adding in 3.5%, and getting the new salary, and that's what I budgeted for 21-22.
Okay, so there's just so many different percentages.
And that's because the percentages are looking at one budget year to the other, not the actual salary to what we have budgeted. If you look at the treasurer's salary in 2021, what's listed in the budget is not the current salary for that position. The current salary position is lower than that. But that's what was budgeted, so that's why that shows as a 2.15% increase. It's a 2.15%, it's a 2.51% increase from budget to budget, but it's not a 2.51% increase actual salary versus new salary.
And what might be kind of adding to the skewing of the percentages is if you remember that the board controls terms and conditions folks for the salaries, and those decisions usually came May or June, last year being the exception, came to May or June. We would put a placeholder number in there, generally, no, let's say 4%, so covering what we think what those increases might be, or not to exceed what those increases might be. And so we would go through, we would have a placeholder in the budget, board would say maybe May or in June, say, okay, that the salary increases would be at 3%, and at 4%, just as a hypothetical. The 3% wouldn't be used, but that 4% number may remain. So when you look at, so when it goes through and readjusts, that would change what that percentage would be. Though the salary may be X dollar amount, what was left in the budget was still a higher amount and then added to the other year. So for, Rich to get that back into place, so those numbers are actuals. Because last year we made that decision prior to the budget, and it sounds like we want to be able to kind of do that again this year. That it takes some adjustment to get back to actuals rather than here's a placeholder number. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this year we went with an assumption of 4%. You always want to err on the higher side of these things. And in May, if we decide to give a 4%, then this year's budget's going to match up with this year's actuals, and will be good. But if we decide to go with 3% instead of 4%, then the budgeted amount is going to be higher than the actual amount. But we're still not going to base the following year's salary increases off what was budgeted. We're going to base it off their actual salary contracts. In the 21-22 budget, the salary numbers are what they're currently being paid this year, plus 4%, 3.5% for staff. They are actual numbers. I can't speak to the 2021 budget because I didn't correct it. I don't know why some of those numbers are in there. There's some numbers that are much higher than the actuals, and I'm going to assume maybe somebody left or somebody's stuck around. or something changed, or there was extra money budgeted because they thought there was gonna be a position added that never came to life, I'm not quite sure. But I can tell you for this year's budget, the salary numbers that are in there are exact.
But no additional staff.
No, the numbers that are put in for 2021,
But I mean, they're all new staff. You are anticipating that those salaries and benefit, all of that
yep,
will come through the federal.
no, or not for the, so not every salary is gonna,
No, I'm talking about new positions. If we put in the ones that are being suggested at the high school, and if there are
Yes.
any additional support staff that need to be added at the elementary, all of, so you've added no additional,
no. And again, because nobody, I mean, I know we have discussed it, and if we had said, yes, we're definitely gonna add these positions, I would have added them in. Can't say all of those positions, I think one that was listed was, English as a second language, those type of people, therapists, psychologists, anything that you need, if we can justify it in terms of helping students get caught up, it's probably gonna be, if we have extra classes now where we need extra teachers because we wanna have a smaller class size because of this, those are things that are gonna be justifiable, as far as I know. Again, there's no exact guidance coming out on that, but from the conversation I had with State Ed on Friday, it seems that's gonna be the case.
so the teacher salaries and like central services, that's mostly Marcia staff?
Central services, let me see.
What line are you?
1620 operations salaries.
1620 operation salaries. Yep, that's the building and maintenance guys, those kind of people, or think.
Because that's less than 1% increase.
It's a 1% increase budget over budget, but it's not a 1% increase from actual salaries to new salaries. And there were some people that had left, that's why the number is so low, is because there are some people that left.
All right, so that does help me to understand the difference, at least in the percentages. Find any, let's see, so I have no additional questions on. One of the things I did want to talk about though is in this budget, some of the stipends, we've increased the district clerk. The stipend was at 4, she wasn't paid 4, she was only paid 3. But we have the tax collector and we have the internal claims auditor. Those numbers have stayed static for years. And we're gonna run into the same issue with those. We're not gonna get anybody who comes in close to $1,000. So is it time to start looking at bumping those up a little bit just to make them, the same percentage that went up, the district clerk went up? We can take those others and do the same thing. Not a lot on the tax collector or the internal claims auditor, but a little bit more on the tax collector. Is that agreeable for people to add that in?
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
So I'm gonna update the budget for the people that didn't get raises last year and put that into the budget as we're gonna try to do it, is that correct? And do we have amounts for like the district clerk? Do we wanna do it a flat amount or do you wanna do it?
Well, the district clerk is already,
Alright,
it
4,000.
was 3,000, but she was being paid 3,000 even though it was budgeted at 4. So from salary to salary, that's still a 25% increase. But we have the internal claims auditor and the tax collector, and those stipends have stayed the same for years.
Okay, do we have any, for budget purposes, do you wanna do a percent increase for the internal claims auditor or a flat fee? Any thoughts? Because if we just want to give them an annual raise, that's one thing, but if we think the salary is too low for the position, it's not competitive, then that's another conversation.
Well, I don't know what the competitive rate is, but I know that hasn't changed in years, and I know we haven't been able to find a district clerk, even at the 4,000.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. I'm just trying to get a consensus from everybody where you want to see this go in terms of budget, a percent increase or a flat? increase?
Now, I want to say tax collector is an hourly.
Is hourly?
Yeah, I want to say both of those positions are hourly positions.
Or are they stipends?
I want to say they're hourly. Let me recheck the organizational, because that's where we set the rates on.
I'll take a look at it tomorrow, and if it's hourly or salaried, and make some increases in those 2 lines, put them into the budget, and give them an updated budget.
All right, so does anybody have any questions on the first part and then moving into central services? The line 1621.450 maintenance, materials and supplies, is that where the COVID?
Maintenance, materials and supplies, 1461, 450.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I raised that up a little bit because last year, those services were provided by BOCES. Some of it was aidable, some is not. And they were provided by BOCES particularly because they were the only ones who had access to it. It was very, very expensive. It was about a $40,000 spend. We're not going to purchase them through BOCES this year because, one, the hard materials that we have, the sprayers and the misters and stuff, we don't need to repurchase. The only thing we would potentially need to repurchase are masks, hand sanitizers, stuff like that. So I added that in that particular line to cover those additional expenses, which at worst case scenario is about $10,000. We have quite a few of them. I had them taking an inventory. We've got a lot of hand sanitizers. We've got a lot of masks still, but if we need to purchase more, I know we're not using them as much as we will when we go back full time. So I put about $10,000 into that line to make sure that if we need to purchase those materials, we have the money available.
So, but basically the increase was the
Yeah,
COVID,
that's exactly
COVID
it.
response, okay. All right, moving, does anybody have any questions? All right, so we'll talk about the salaries and take a look at those. One of the things I did have in the instruction area, it was 2040.150 and 2040.160. They were the special education supervisor or instruction salary and the non-instructional. And I believe some of that money was covered under grants, but they don't show up at all.
What is it, 20-0?
You're not even on here, so they're.
Yeah, so if they're covered by grants, they shouldn't be in this budget, they are in the F budget.
Okay. Because I think the condition of accounts shows money being drawn from those lines.
I think I know that there may have been money drawn from those lines this year. I don't know if they were coded correctly at one point in time. I know that those positions are now in that particular budget. And when I ran this, if they're, at one point in time, I think when I first got here they were, but they've been correctly coded, so I don't know how old your information is from the current budget, but if there was any activity in this year or last year, it would have showed up in this report. The only thing that isn't showing up if there's zeros and 2 lines. So my guess is that budget money and those expenses were both transferred to the F budget, which is why they're not showing up here on this report.
So who sees the F budget?
We can,
I mean, we don't see it, so who sees it?
if you want it, I can most definitely provide it to you.
That and I want to say it again, the cafeteria. So now there's some differences in contractual issues here. A couple of them are up a lot. Is that, just curious as to what the increase is?
Can you give me a budget line?
2020, 410, is that
20
over 300%?
2024-10.
Yeah.
That was provided from the high school budget. When I first got here, the high school gave me their budget requests. The elementary school gave me their budget requests, special ed. All those departments gave me those requests. I put those amounts in the budget per the request. And, you know, the idea behind the budget was to put the requests in, see where the budget fell. And, you know, I couldn't begin to tell you what the contractual is. I think, you know, the high school principal can talk about it more, but yearly, these are services that are provided to the students, like online programming, online content.
I didn't know there's a new, can't remember the name of it, Ms. Adams talked about it at the beginning of the year.
Yep.
If that was the computer,
Yeah,
yeah.
with the career.
It's usually something that's a subscription-based type of stuff where we have to pay annually or every year.
The Naviance.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
That,
Ms. Adams, did you want to speak to that at all?
no, I just was curious if that's
Oh,
what it was.
okay.
I would have to quickly, while you're speaking, I'll look it up, but I know Naviance would be in there, and again, we put in, but I don't know actually how some of that gets coded, so I'd have to look. But I know, there was some confusion over the past on how a few things were coded, so I know Naviance is, something that was not budgeted last year, but we did, have some additional money, so we put that in. We're in the process of starting it this year, and for next year, I think that's about 1,800 to 2,000, if I recall correctly. I'm not sure, where previously our subscription for Achieve, I don't know, Rich, if you know off the top of your head, so we have a reading program, that's Achieve, that's about $3,000. So some of those are contractual, that's our reading program. So I'm not sure, in the past, sometimes I think there was, I know, I'm not sure if it was previously coded as technology, and maybe that's, I know Rich has been kind of recoding everything consistently. So I could look up on, I can get my copy out, but it will just take me a minute. I was just pulling up to see, Lori keeps a copy of them all.
Just curious, just
But
when
that's
there's a large swing.
That is. And I'm not sure which area we put the iReady under. We switched from Star over to iReady. So, that, I don't know if that's in which, if that's in the high school
Probably
or the elementary, but that would be another one.
Not the
Well, you know, it might have gone under K-12 because there's a significant decrease at the K-6 level, and there's a corresponding increase at your level, so it probably did get coded to one over the other, so that
It could be.
makes sense.
And I can, work with Rich if you want to have more detail on that, but I'll work with him, but those are the ones off the top of my head that, most likely are in there. Also in the contractual, which has probably been pretty consistent, is, you know, like our microscope cleaning, those types of things.
Thank you.
Oh, the 2020 contractual, yeah, so actually I talked to your office. There was a reading program that was purchased for an English teacher, Folino, F-O-L-I-N-O. So that was part to help catch the students up. The science department had money put in for equipment for repairing and replacing microscopes and that type of stuff. And the rest of the budget was brought in from Eastman for music, again, repairing and replacing music equipment. So that's where that's all came.
The reading program, the
Yes.
one that helped to help students catch up.
Yep.
Is that something that should be considered under those federal funds? Or is that something that they use generally?
I
We
think,
use that consistently in our reading program, so that's one of our main curriculums, so I'm not sure if that would qualify, but just to give Rich a little background, that's something that we use year to year.
Okay, so it's
I don't know if that's in any of the grant AIS titles, but.
okay. No, if it's, I can't supplant, the federal monies cannot supplant what you're currently using, so that would answer that? Okay. Alrighty, so, Just out of curiosity, moving on to the teaching one.
Yep.
So you've answered the salary question.
Yep.
But what is the rate for retirement? You indicated there was an increase, but you never gave us the.
I think it's, ERS is like 9.7%. I have them written up on my wall, so they came again, it's a flat fee, and I think it's,
No.
it went up, I think it's, ERS is 9.7. That's the number that sticks in my head.
So I knew there was an increase, I just didn't know what the rate was. So, for me, now I know that, so you've actually done some things as far as changing the codes of things, so that might indicate some of the swings that we're seeing here in the changing of the lines?
I didn't necessarily change any codes.
Okay.
What we did is put things in the correct bucket. Like if, I know in the beginning, there were a couple things that fell under the F fund that were in the general fund, so we cleaned those things up when we got here, myself and, Lynn really was the driver of that before I got here, and it's really nobody's, I didn't have a business manager for 6 months, so when I got here with Lynn, we went through the budget and made sure that the stuff that we wanted to get federal funding for was in that F bucket, so that when we put the ST3 in at the end of the year, that money went to the right places, so we were able to get those funds continued.
And I do see, just out of curiosity, how many students do we send to the CTE program?
The OC program?
Posted Occupational Program?
What's that?
CTE,
23 is what we're budgeted at for next year,
23?
and that's at a flat rate.
Anybody have any questions of the teacher? All right, the library. And then moving on to pupil services, 2805, 150,
2805, what is it?
2805,
Yeah.
150.
150. So that was a position where somebody retired and was replaced in the guidance office. We have a new person in the guidance office. And if you go down here, 2810, 150, there was a new hire that was previously coded at that spot. So when they created the budget last year, that money was in there for the person who previously held that position. When that person left, obviously that budget money wasn't expended, and that person was coded correctly into the instructional salary guidance. So that's why you see the increase on the very next line, 2810, 150, because that person who was hired was put into that code, which is proper, and that money, that 90,626, is the additional budget monies that we had as a placeholder for the new CSE position, the new full-time position. If we wanted to go from a part-time to a full-time position, that's the money that we're going to use for next year's budget, since.
So why don't we put that in that line rather than?
As, well, only because we still haven't decided if we're going to hire a therapist or a full-time CSE position. Once we make that decision, those where those monies will go. It's long, we've got the, as long as we've got, I want to get it in the right places so that when we look at our financial reports, that's correct. And, but, we know the money's there. As soon as we get some direction on where to go with that, that money will be reallocated in the budget. And if we don't make that decision until after the budget is put in place, that's an easy journal entry, easy budget transfer to when we do decide.
Any other questions in that line? It's, if you wanted to just put it there in the, see, is that the line though that you said that,
Well, we don't have that full-time position, so if we decide to
but-
make that, then we'll create that budget code and enter it in.
But what you were saying before at 204150, special ed supervision was in the grant?
21, what
And
was
that's
it?
a CSE person, right?
I don't know if that CSE is just a stipend at this point in time. It's not a full-time position.
Right, but if we turn it into a full-time position, wouldn't it go into that line 2040.150?
2040.150.
Which is not in your budget, but it was in your
20
condition of accounts.
If it's federally funded, it will go into the F fund in that particular budget. If it isn't federally funded, it will go into, yes, one of those other lines.
But that's why you said it wasn't in this budget, so
The person who's currently in that position is a secretary, I believe it's a secretary position, and I'll can get you a more concrete answer on that, but if it's in your budget and not in here, it was because it was moved to the F fund, because it was grant funded.
And generally, that office gets paid out of the 611 or 619 grant.
I know, but what I'm saying is, that's the $90,000, if it's going to be used for that position, if it's currently in the grant, does it need to stay in that line?
Well, I don't
That's
know
what I'm
if
asking.
with a full-time, I don't know if
We
the
had-
full-time position is in the 611 grant or not, I'm not quite sure. Because right now, the CSE chair position isn't in the F, it's in the regular budget. Because that's a stipend for a current full-time employee, and that's in the regular budget, so because it's in the regular budget, I don't believe it's federally funded. But I can double check. I know it's in the regular budget.
It is in your condition of accounts, you're showing a negative 36,000 unencumbered balance in that line. So somebody's being paid out of that line, so.
Somebody was being paid out of that line, because it was in there, and I don't know when your copy was ran,
Well,
but
this was the last time you gave it to us, was March 31st. So, all right, so those are properly coded then?
yes.
All right, so they're moving into the sports, there's some hefty increases, is that the equipment?
So when I spoke to the athletic director, I went through the budget that he presented, just to get some clarification. Let's see. So we go to, what is it, we're talking about 2855, equipment athletics. I have that budget broken down. A lot of all the equipment we're talking about, there's a pole vault because we're currently having track and field, and we have to borrow one, I believe, from Greenwich because we don't have our own. A lot of that is baseballs. We're talking soccer balls, basketballs, all the stuff that we use pretty much day to day. Each individual line isn't a lot, but when you add up all the sports we play, it gets significant. It gets a little bit more expensive. And I don't know, because they didn't play sports last year, maybe they didn't replace them or budget for them because they knew we were going to play as many sports. But basically, went to the
Well, it
line.
was all budgeted,
Yeah.
because we made an assumption that we would budget for the entire,
Okay.
full year.
Yeah.
But that is something that is driven by what you say they need.
Yeah, I have it's the budget that he provided, and he went through every sport. Mouth guards, shin guards for the soccer players, nets, socks for the soccer players, that type of stuff. Something that's, used once and not over again.
And,
So that's the equipment line, contractual athletics. That was the contracts that he gave us. The athletics officials, last year it was budgeted at $12,500 because sports were not being played. I went back to the last pre-COVID amount, which was 25. So basically, that's what I decided to budget. The contracts for officials have not gone up significantly, and I'm not quite sure if you played as many sports now as you did then. So that's why you see the 12.5 increase, because it was budgeted for a reduction in the amount of sports, and we're gonna budget for what is hopefully a full season next year.
At first we thought we were going to move towards leasing buses, but
Yep.
that seems to, that decision was revised?
Well, we had a discussion the last time we were together, and I started looking into lease versus buying. And then I went and revisited the current bus schedule. And the two buses that we're going to replace are 2014s, which puts them between 7 and 8 years old. And they're only at 77,000 miles. And they seem to be in pretty good shape. without much, that the repair bills were a couple $1,000s on each of those buses last year. So when we started talking about the budget, I started to think, what do we really need? So I put a little survey out to all the business managers that I'm working in the area, and most of them try to keep buses 10 years, 100, 110,000 miles. Nobody has replaced buses at 77,000 unless there was something significantly wrong that they knew wasn't going to be covered under warranty. We don't have that situation. And consider we were putting, a high number out to the public, and, I looked at it, if this was my business, would I replace those buses now? Or would I, try to get the full use out of them? And, I talked to Dave and everyone, and, at 77,000 miles, I think, we don't need to spend $40,000 on new buses this year. I don't know if we put less miles on it, but we have a replacement plan put together, and the replacement plan seems to be pretty aggressive. And I don't know if that replacement plan was put together by the people who sell us the buses, or if it was put together by the previous transportation manager, but we feel comfortable that we can extend that for a year and, get our money out of those, because those buses are currently purchased, so there's not a lease payment or a purchase payment on them.
Well, the bus we just sold the bus here a few months ago.
Yeah.
How many miles? I was thinking that one had more than 77,000 on it. I was thinking that was closer to that number.
Probably close to 100. And that had generally been the number where we would get to, that we were putting 100,000 miles onto a bus in that 5-year time frame. And that's where part of the leasing argument came in, was that our warranties on our buses ran out after 5 years. So the warranties were gone. We'd get to 100,000, which is when DOT, would start paying attention a little more closely to our buses. The aid that we would get on these buses would be, at that point, out, and for the value of the bus, we weren't really getting a ton back. I think we just sold one, the one we just sold was like $2,500. Right there.
Absolutely.
So yeah, we kind of put all that together, and that's, okay, let's lease them because it costs us less. We still get the aid like we would in the 5 years. The 5 years runs out the warranty for any of the work comes on. We still put about $100,000 on, 100,000 miles on it. We trade it in, and it kind of fits, where our schedule falls. But at 77, at $77,000 when Rich was sharing that with me, it was, we still have another $30,000, 30,000 miles on this bus really, before we really need to consider it going by the wayside. And a lot of that's COVID related. I'm going to guess we didn't use the trip, we didn't transport as much, the bus wasn't on the road as much. And since there doesn't seem to be any report of any major mechanical issues or problems or concerns, that we're still okay for you.
So how does that change in the replacement cycle? Will it have any kind of impact on any state aid?
No, we only so we're not spending anything, so we're not getting state aid on those buses because they're over 5 years old, and the state aid goes over 5 years, so we're not getting state aid on those buses this year, which means we won't get them next year. Now, if we purchase or we lease the 2 new buses, we would get state aid on those, but we'd also have the lease payment. So we'd still have more of an expense than we would. I think our
So the 48,000 would have covered 2 leases?
2 leases, yes. 40,000 I think was the budget.
And the state aid almost covers the lease in its entirety. We're something like 90% for our aid on transportation. So when you see so when we start talking about cutting transportation, it almost comes out as a wash because you get so much in transportation aid versus in the miles you use, but it is all based on aidable miles, of course.
So, just devil's advocate,
Okay.
is to save the 2 buses that still have additional miles on them.
Mhm.
But if we keep the rotation going so that we keep 2 new buses in their warranty, and it doesn't cost us all that much extra to maintain the 2 new buses, why not do it that way?
We
So that
absolutely.
we have buses that are within warranty, newer, and if the other 2 buses still have some life, if there's extra bays, some of those.
We can absolutely go that way and have a couple spare, that's what I think I'm hearing you suggest. That'll change some costing a little bit because generally we try to trade it in depending on what the value is.
But historically, the buses, we've given them away, right? We just give them away here.
Yeah, if you can find somebody to pay for them.
So
I mean,
if you
Sorry.
took, I'm sorry, if you took those two, you would trade them in on a lease?
No, we would, I mean, the buses that we have currently, I don't know what the value, probably, I mean, it's hard
Yeah.
to sell a used bus with 77. We'd probably maybe get, the last buses were about $2,500 a piece. Let's say we got $4,000 a piece, we get 8,000 for them. But the leases would be somewhere on $20,000 a piece. That is eatable to some point, but there would still be, you know, probably, I think it's an 82% or something like that, eatable piece, so we're still gonna have, you know, the expenses, and again, we pay the expenses next year, we get the aid in the following year, so, that's how that reimbursement works. So if we were to take the bus leases on next year, then we would file our next year's ST3, and that would be calculated into our transportation costs with the state, and then 22-23 is when we would start getting the aid for those buses.
But I guess what I'm saying is, are we gonna impact the state aid? for
No,
next year?
no, we're not getting state aid for those buses, and the state aid that was calculated doesn't include the two leases, so that's not gonna change. It would be higher if we got two new leases, but it's not currently in the numbers reflected in the revenue portion from the state.
I mean, they're reaching maximum mileage, right?
Mhm. It's, the advantage is then is it takes some of those upward budget expenditure pressures. I think was in part of the thinking, was that because that number's so big, that if we can find ways to kind of reduce that upward projection on the expenditure side of the budget, so that'll help, because right now it's almost, it's over 10%. If the lower we can keep that number, the better off we would be. But we want to maintain the rotation. The transportation director would like 2 new buses,
Yeah,
I think, and having a spare is,
Because it impacts us, I guess, not for the next year, but it
Mhm.
impacts us on the expense side, but it also favorably impacts us on the revenue side, right? I mean, it creates that revenue. Right, if it's 9, so it's 90, about 9%,
No, it's 82.3% or something like that.
on purchases,
What's that?
on
Purchases and leases, yeah,
either way.
over 5 years. So it's not like we get whether we purchase it or lease it, that's spread out over 5 years, so.
And no vans or trucks or any other vehicle needs,
That wasn't on rotation.
any thoughts about the bus?
Well, I guess, it was just, 2 years ago that we had, I think maybe when we merged the sport, that we were a bus short, right, and ended up leasing another bus probably through the year, I forget exactly what how are our?
yeah, what was that, Bob? It was, we had it was another special ed run, I want to say.
Yeah.
Or we had one more run pop up that we needed. I don't think it was the athletic one because we make them wait. But yeah, we had to do the emergency lease of a bus. I just can't remember if it was a smaller bus or a larger bus. But it was a 1-year lease.
So, does it make sense on if we're gonna, with merge sports, to not make them wait? Now, maybe drivers is gonna be a challenge, right, that maybe we're waiting for a driver as much as for a bus?
It depends on the day, depends on timing.
When I talked to them today, I think the biggest bottleneck we have over there are drivers, not necessarily equipment. But that's pretty much the way it is for every school district. On Friday, every business manager was asking if anybody had bus drivers. There's a shortage throughout the states, probably the country, so.
I'm just thinking with the not allowing as many students on the bus too. You know what I mean, like limitations with the 22 passengers, right?
That's
I
a
mean,
good
is
point,
that,
Jackie.
You know,
Because we don't know what that's gonna be next year.
yeah, I
so-
mean, I'm assuming it's gonna stay.
No, that'll be a driver problem.
That'll be it, right, yeah.
Yeah, because getting 2
Yeah.
more full-time, but having 2 more buses in the
Buses,
fleet.
you know, So that's something
Wouldn't
to
hurt.
think about too.
If it sounds like it's close in cost.
So
It
keep
might give
them.
you some flexibility in the bus garage.
Okay.
I just think also it's, you take the money out of the budget, sometimes it's hard to get it back in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's a significant
Mm-hmm.
change to take out then put back in. So that would have to be a proposition?
Yep, it is still currently on the list and is still officially is still part of our, legal announcement. The buses are still on there. So, and these are 65 passengers, right? If I remember correctly?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
So, yeah, so we'll just keep it on the proposition list.
And so I'm clear, that's purchase or lease?
Please.
Yeah, the jump to straight to a purchase, I mean, then I think whether purchasing at 125,
Yeah.
I'm from the hip there a little bit, but you know, that's a pretty big jump.
Pretty big number, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, especially, yeah, it's tough to go in that direction, right? And we kind of,
Yeah. Now, if we wanted to maybe walk into it and say we'll go one bus and purchase, but even then, the lease is what, 48,000?
Yeah, 40,000.
40,000, yeah, that's still a big,
And
jump.
more and more school districts, Queensbury is getting 12 buses, they're leasing them all. I did another informal survey of all the schools in the area. It's 50-50, but more and more schools are starting to go to lease versus purchase. Just because, again, when you turn it in, you don't get any money. Sometimes you can't even give the buses away. And now you're on a 5-year rotation, you don't have to worry about any expenses out of warranty. It reduces the risk after that 5 years while we don't plan for anything. If you have a transmission or a drivetrain or something in the engine going on one of those buses, you usually can see $10,000 or $15,000 bills. So it reduces the risk. It keeps your fleet up to date, modern. You don't have to worry about kids' safety and buses breaking down. And so that's why most schools are, and it's $5,000, $6,000 a year less for the lease than it is for the purchase.
And so as far as retired teachers were, everything's based on their contracts and
Yep.
health insurance. Okay. So that brings us to the big change, which is the debt service. And so that's one of the reasons, you know, to have this conversation. I mean, we will have that number, but if we don't have to come up with the same, the $1 million as opposed to the 134, that would change how that number would look, would it not?
What's that change the?
As far as what we would have to come up with as far as.
Sure, it just pushes that payment
Mhm.
from next year to the year after.
But then we would have in the pipeline the aid,
If we pay it,
because that's not shown here, is it?
yeah, no, and again, how was it, and I will confirm this with fiscal advisors, but how was it explained to me 6 or 8 weeks ago was, the reason to keep it there was because we get the funding for it. Nobody seemed to if you don't make the payment, they didn't think state aid was gonna give you a payment for something, you know, was going to give you state aid for something that you didn't pay in that fiscal year. So and I realize it's not saying that, and I'll get some confirmation, but the way that was explained to me, was that it would be paid in the year 22, but in the next fiscal year, not this one, and I'll clarify that, and if, what this is showing is true, and we can make a decision from there.
Does anybody else have any further questions? So we need to clarify the questions about the debt service. And for the budget that's currently that we're going to be putting up for a vote, we are not going to include any new staff requests? It's all going to come through the federal?
well,
Is that what you're saying?
here's what I've got for for personnel.
Okay.
Guy, and Rich, but when you need to. Guidance is in the budget
Yes.
for the replacement for the high school counselor. School psychologist, which is Lisa Hanson, that's in the budget. The elementary special education teacher, that is in the budget. The elementary teacher, again, we're both retirements, that's in the budget. Okay, so those are budget items. The CSE position, depending on what we want to do, will depend on which grant it comes out of. Whether that ends up coming out of a 611 or if it comes up out of the budget. So where's the CSE going to come
Now,
out of?
so that CSE chair, there's money in the budget from the position that wasn't filled. And for the CSE chair, because we've had one, and again, until I get, that money is in the budget, and I suggest leaving it in the budget, because depending on how the state and federal government comes back, if they say you already had a CSE chair, even though you're moving it to full-time, it may not fall under the grant, so we have it in the budget. But if it does come federally funded, then we can still put that position, right now, I can't say 100% that CSE chair is gonna be something that falls under the grant. Therapists, yes, psychologists, yes, from what I'm told, but a chairperson, that's more of a traditional position that you have.
But if
A
the,
director,
So the money's,
not a chairperson.
Right.
so the money's, I say we keep the money in the budget, we have the money in the budget to cover that position. If we're able to get federal funding, we'll take advantage of those dollars, and we don't spend that money in the budget. And if they don't include it in the federal budget, we can still put that position into the general budget.
But if we hired a school psychologist, that would fall under?
The language is very vague, they put out a brief paragraph.
Just because it kind of falls in with
Yeah,
therapist
so
or
they've-
counselor.
Yeah, they basically, and again, those are things that, logically, when they talk about the idea behind the funds, it's to bring in resources to help kids when they come back full-time next year. And when you think about that, therapists and psychologists, it said English as a second language, those were things where people were gonna need additional help. In addition to, after-school activities and enrichment, summer enrichment, when you look at the ideas and what they're talking about, it's all additional services to help keep the students caught up. So that seems to make sense to me. The CSE chair is one of those things that we could try it, see what they say. But at least I'm less confident about that position. I'd rather have that money in the budget. And again, if we don't use it, we've not lost anything, we can put it to the federal funds. If they say no, we've got the money covered in the budget, so we can still have that position.
If it's a full-time position, it would be director of special ed or
Yeah.
pupil
Yeah.
services. It
Right.
would be more than just the
Right.
CSA, so.
and it depends on how we do it. If we do the psychologist route, you might be able to put the psychologist in the grant and then put the CSE piece in the regular budget. So that possibility exists, but if we do the administrative route, then if we have it in the budget, it's in the budget, so.
And which it is, because
Yes.
Yes.
the line is there. Okay.
I'm just gonna put the word mix next to that.
But this is all speculative as far as how we're gonna move forward, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, we're covering our
Right.
bases, we're anticipating
Mhm.
things.
Yes.
Right. Now, there's two other spots, positions that were COVID related that we didn't hire this year, that we're gonna need to add back in once we get everyone back. One of them is a cafeteria worker. The vacancy's already there, it's not a new position. We ran one last all year, that's there, but in talking with Wendy, she said, if we're coming back, I'm gonna need that position back, that comes out of the cafeteria budget, so that it's there. The other is especially a special education position. Because we were able to do so much remotely with special ed and special ed services, and we had some families who homeschooled their children or waived services, we were able to manage the special ed needs this year without that position. In talking with Lisa and Karen, tell me if I'm messing any of this up in translation. But when we come back full-time without those remote opportunities, if they're not there, we're gonna need a full spot. I would say that position goes into the grant. And then we'll handle it from there. And then the support folks that we were talking about would go into the grant. So for positions into the budget that we're bringing to voters, it's those replacement of retirees, and then some portion, small or large, for CSE. Everyone else falls in underneath either the cafeteria budget or falls in underneath federal grant.
In the past, I know that we've transferred some money into the cafeteria. Is that something that we need to consider for this budget?
Nope, and talking with Rich and talking with Wendy, they didn't believe we needed to do that for next year.
So they were able to sustain themselves?
So,
with
yeah,
the-
and that's ultimately the goal, is that the cafeteria is able to sustain itself.
Right, well, if we can answer that question about the debt service so that we have a clear understanding of how we can move forward with that. Is
Yep.
there any other questions that,
I've just got one more thing on the ballot,
okay?
just so we know where everything is. So we're gonna have the budget. It's not really a proposition, but that's like
Right.
proposition one, right? The budget, the buses are gonna stay on the ballot as a proposition. We talked about a capital reserve, but we haven't talked about a dollar amount. If we wanted to keep language, bring to the voters to open a capital reserve, I'd recommend a $5 million number. The reason I would recommend 5 million is because when we did this with the previous project, we went on to 3 million. And we actually ended up being able to save more than 3 million in a very short period of time. So if we're looking for projects down the road that we don't want to impact especially smaller projects, because hopefully this one is taking care of the bigger stuff, a larger pot of money will allow you to have more in reserves for future use. It doesn't mean you have to fill it, it doesn't mean you have to spend it all. Well, within 10 years, if I remember correctly. But just a little bit bigger dollar amount will give you more flexibility and another place to keep saving for the rainy day.
And we have to indicate how much money we were going to put in there as a starter amount, correct?
I would have to double check with bond council when we would put that language together, but whatever that minimum number is, I would phrase that language to say minimally this dollar amount.
And because the original proposal for the capital project did have a certain, I can't remember, it was two different numbers that were broken down that were appropriated fund balance and.
Yeah, and then there was the capital reserve. Because in that language, that's the reason why the other one was broken down differently, is because the interest we gained in that reserve exceeded that $3 million mark. So in that language, we actually had to go in through the proposition and say we want to expand the proposition from the 3 million to the 3.2 million, and then we want to expend the 3.2 million into the project. So that way we could use all the interest that we had gathered as well from there, if I remember correctly for that. So it's, I have it on the list. I just need to know what that top number is.
Then that's included in your notice that's gone out that.
We have it there currently, that's gone there, but we can adjust that notice as it goes on. We actually plan on, once we get this set, we plan on extending that legal notice a couple weeks, just to make sure we have the final accurate information out. It's going to end up being 6 notifications instead of 4, but because this year's been a little bit of a crazy year, we'd rather have a couple extra weeks of the most accurate information we can put out before the newsletter and the legal notice that we can. The library, remember, is on there. And the student board member is on there. And then 2 spots open, it's Jackie's and Heidi's seat. Yesterday was the last day at 4 o'clock to receive ballots, and we received ballots from 2, the incumbents.
Oh.
So.
I like your chances.
Good.
So,
That means we have 2 people running. Good.
so we'll do that, and we'll work, in fact, Gina and I are looking on what we have to do to, about selection of order since there's one per seat, it's pretty easy. But for us, the next step is once the ballot's approved, so we can get it set out, so we can get out to our military folks, so we can get it out to the, our shut-ins and our disabled. Look, we need to and get ballots ordered and those things. So that's right now what the ballot is.
Is there any other, just the capital reserve would require voter
Just-
approval?
Yep, just the capital reserve, just to set a dollar amount. And the other piece I have to double check is I think the board has to approve the ballot. Which would be next time, because we did it in years before.
The information that was shared by John Hales indicated that we should be moving, I guess, DRS or TRS or something money. Is that something that's just done by board action?
Well, we're moving the
Reserves
reserve
for
from.
retirement contributions?
So when we originally put the budget, we we're gonna move 180,000 from their employee reserves because we thought that was overfunded. And then when Lynn and I last week started working on the property tax cap report card, and I think I gave you copies of that, we realized that if we ran the budget like we wanted to, we would be over that 4% cap, somewhere around 11%. And we were digging down it in the audit. So what we did is we used more of the reserve fund and lowered the amount of the DRS fund so that we kept that money in the reserve and took it out of the reserve fund to get us back down to 4%. I don't. Got extra copies. That's that report I give you when I hand it in. So, when you look at the property tax cap that we have, currently, we're looking at $2.29 million in the adjusted restricted fund balance. If we assign $1,043,600 to this year's budget to pay to included revenues, it'll leave us at $623,994 or at 4%. So that's what we need to do to keep us at that 4% cap. And so what we did is we used more of the unassigned appropriated fund balance and took that money and put it back into the retirement system to use at a later date. In addition to that, so that's what we did. We just moved it around to keep us under the 4% cap. It's about the same amount of money. We're just taking it from different places to make sure we fall under that full 4% cap.
That the assigned appropriated fund balance, last year we had 467,951
Right.
for levy reduction. Are we anticipating that we will be able to put that amount on the levy as well?
We can. When I spoke to Lynn, I asked her if that money we needed to use was going to be, allocated for anything. I mean, if we decide to change that property tax cap, then we are going to need, we may, depending on what, we may have to pull some of those reserve funds back out, because obviously we're gonna go to the voters with a reduction or something else. So we're gonna have to come up with more money to fund our budget for next year. So we'll have to take it maybe from that retirement system or some more from allocated funds.
But we will have a clear picture on Thursday when we meet.
We will, I'm hoping to have all those questions answered tomorrow. Get that information out to you tomorrow, so we'll have a clear answer, definitely by Thursday for sure. I'll get a hold of fiscal advisors first thing in the morning to clarify. I'll provide everyone all that information and
The adjustments in.
then I'll make the adjustments and bring it Thursday so we can.
And I guess the question is hourly or stipend for,
Yeah, I'll find out if they're hourly. I'll put them in an hourly increase. And again, I'll update the budget so that the people who did not get raises last year, I'll budget, basically I'll look at I'll assume a 4% raise for this year even if we don't use it. And then I'll base their next fiscal year's contract off the new amount, not their current amount. And I'll put that all in the budget, that way it's there if we want to utilize it, and if not, we don't spend it.
any other questions? Anybody have- questions? Dan, Heidi?
Miriam's got a question, I think. Can I get out this side? Yeah, sure.
Jackie, Bob, any questions or
I'm
concerns?
all set, thank
No? So, we wait the updates and we'll take a look at the whole thing.
And did we want to go look at the lockers?
you. Oh, that's right.
Oh, that's right.
Or, I know two folks are at home. I can carry it around on my computer if you wanted me to. They're waving and giving the thumbs up. So that way if
I'm
you're-
sure that Jackie, Bob, and Ann can make sure they're perfect.
Yes. I
Thank
would
you, guys.
concur.
That's it from, Rich, you got anything?
No.
I'm all set.
The lockers,
Thank you.
John showed us that there would be a change order, once this was completed, is that something that
Yeah.
you're still looking at?
Once they get the okay, they can do their next step in the,
Okay. Also, I meant to ask this, I thought about it afterward, the piping, the heat that you're gonna put in, is that gonna be a change order For the project?
Right.
into the elementary?
I'm not sure if that's gonna end up being a change order, if they're gonna do that, they call it a ticket and something else, where they just charge us as a separate entity. If it ends up being project work, I'll double check
Okay,
to see where that goes. But that's slated to be in by Thursday. Okay, we're going to adjourn, or,
well, we're still.
oh, we're still running? Okay,
Right?
Yep.
We're still on the clock?
we're still on the clock. Pausing the recording.